The 2023-24 NFL draft class are now officially 12 weeks into their NFL career, and while some players have came in and been instant impacts, some players have not. So in today's video, I wanted to grade every single rookie from picks 31 to 16, and then in a few days, I'm going to be dropping the 16 to number 1. Now before we actually start getting into these grades, I did want to do a bit of housekeeping before we actually enter into these grades. For starters, again, these are only 12 weeks into their NFL career, so no player is going to get an F because I don't think any of these players are quite yet that level. The lowest grade I'm going to be giving is going to be a D-, and those would be for players who maybe either A, haven't been playing much at all, or B, just have not been very productive. And lastly, all of these NFL players will have ample time to prove that they are not bust or that they will eventually become stars in the NFL. So just because this player might get a D- or a B or a C does not mean that will be their entire grade for the rest of their careers. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into my grades. And we will begin with the 31st overall pick, Felix Azoma. I am so sorry if I mispronounced the name, I am horrible with pronouncing names. In his short career thus far, he has 6 solo tackles, 3 assisted tackles, half a sack, 1 forced fumble, and a PFF grade of a 55.5. I think it's pretty safe to say that he hasn't necessarily been as good as they might have wanted him to be. Coming out of college, he was an extremely productive player, and I think the team wanted to see more from him, and thus far, he's had certain games where he hasn't even produced a single stat. Again, he has plenty of time to prove that he's going to be a great player, but for now, I'm going to give this pick a C-. Up next, we have the number 30th overall pick, Nolan Smith, who was selected by the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, Nolan Smith, coming out of Georgia, was known for his incredible speed and his ability to be a blue chip prospect with a ton of talent and potential. And thus far, through the couple games we have seen him, it really hasn't been that incredible. On the year, he has 3 solo tackles, 1 assisted tackles, 1 sack, and a 52.9 PFF grade. Now, it's very important that we do understand that he's only shown up in 5 games this year. So I think given the fact that he has showed up in the 5 games, I think he's had a slightly better start to his career than the last pick. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, but that being said, I don't think I can grade him anything higher than a C-. Next up, we have the 29th overall pick, which is going to be from the New Orleans Saints, and in that pick, they took Bresee, the defensive tackle out of Clemson. Now, coming out of college, Brian was really known for his versatility along the defensive line. You can line him up in the middle, you can line him up on the edge, he was going to be successful basically anywhere. But that being said, the biggest knock on him was his inconsistency, and I do think that has kind of followed him into the NFL thus far. On the year, he has 9 solo tackles, 4 assisted tackles, 2 sacks, and a grade of a 45.5 PFF grade. Now, I do think he's actually had a relatively good start to his career, but like I mentioned earlier, it's just been a little bit inconsistent right now. He will have certain weeks where he shows up and has a really solid game, and then other weeks where he doesn't necessarily have a great game. And being in that Saints defensive line room, he has had multiple opportunities to go out there and shine, and I think he's done a relatively good job of that. Again, while inconsistent, I do think he has been the best of the 3 picks we've talked about. So with that being said, I'm going to give this pick a B-. Let's go ahead and move on to our 20th overall pick, which is going to be Myles Murphy, the edge rusher from Clemson, who was selected by the Cincinnati Bengals. Adding some context to this pick, they really wanted him to become one of their rotational pass rushers, and while they already have a guy in Trey Hendrickson who could do a lot of the little things, it could be a sack merchant, Myles Murphy was really brought in there to be an explosive element to that defensive line room. And thus far this season, while it hasn't been necessarily glorious, it has gotten better as of late. Thus far this season, he has 5 solo tackles, 3 assisted tackles, 2 sacks, and a PFF grade of 57.3. It is also noteworthy to say that he's only played 6 games this season, so I think given the context of everything he's been put through, I do think he's having a relatively decent year. Again, the production has really amped up over the course of the last couple weeks, and with the injury of Joe Burrow, I do imagine that he's going to get more and more playing time to prove his talent, so I do think this pick will age well, but I just don't think I can put him anything higher than Brian Bresee. I'm going to give this pick a C+. But now let's go ahead and move on to this 27th overall pick, Anton Harrison, the offensive tackle out of Oklahoma, and he was selected by the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, coming out of the draft, I really like this pick for the Jaguars because they definitely needed talent in that offensive tackle room, and while Anton Harrison has definitely not been pretty, it's definitely been better than I think what most people are making it out to be. On the season thus far, he's played 736 offensive snaps, and he's only had 4 penalties and has allowed 5 sacks. Definitely not the cleanest stats, especially when you look at his PFF grade of a 55.1, but I think given the context of the current situation the Jaguars are in, I actually think this is going to end up aging pretty well. It's been a bit of a mixed bag for him as at times he's gotten exposed by players like Chris Jones, but I do think as time goes on, he's going to get better and better. So for this pick, I'm actually going to give it a relatively high grade just based off the fact that I think his potential is a little bit higher than some of the past players. So for this pick, I'm going to give it a B-. Next up at pick 26, the Dallas Cowboys selected Mazi Smith, the defensive tackle out of Michigan. Mazi Smith was taken for his size, his athleticism, and his overall ability to stuff the run. And thus far this year, it's kind kind of been a mixed bag similar to Anton Harrison. Except unlike Anton Harrison, Mazi Smith has not been receiving as much playing time. He has been in at spots and has been relatively decent when he's been out there. On the year, he has 7 solo tackles, 4 assists, 0 sacks, and a PFF grade of 52.7. And similar to a lot of players, I do think as time has gone on, his play has gotten better and better, but as of right now, it just has been kind of lackluster. Dallas's run defense has been really good, but I don't really think it's been necessarily because of Mazi Smith. Jonathan Hankins and Oso Digizua have been a very nice 1-2 combination in the middle of that defensive line, and oftentimes the big plays happen when Mazi Smith is out there. So while I do think Mazi Smith has a lot of potential to still get into, I don't think he's really been worth the pick. So for this grade, I'm going to give it a D+. Next up at the 25th overall pick, the Buffalo Bills selected the tight end out of Utah, Dalton Kincaid, and thus far this season, he has gotten better and better as time has gone on. On the year, he has 64 targets with 56 receptions, 474 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns, and has a PFF grade of 67.9. Now, coming out of Utah, we all knew Dalton Kincaid would probably struggle with the run blocking stuff, but fortunately for him, he was put into a very nice situation where that was not what he was going to be asked to do. The Buffalo Bills drafted him to be a second primary target for Josh Allen, and thus far this year, I think he's been worth the pick. Given the context of all the picks that have been taken after him, I do think this was the best pick thus far. So given the context of his situation and how productive he's been this year, I'm going to give this pick an A-. At pick number 24, the New York Giants selected the cornerback out of Maryland, Deonte Banks. Now for Deonte, it has been a mixed bag, as I've said for a lot of these players. Certain weeks he looks very good, and then certain weeks he looks really bad. And I think that's kind of what the Giants expected. I don't think they had expectations for him to be this Pro Bowl level player week 1. I think he was taken with the idea of him being developed into a future star. So I think when adding that context to his stats, I think it looks a little bit better. On the year, Deonte Banks has 38 solo tackles, 2 interceptions. He's been targeted 75 times, which is the 3rd highest in the NFL, by the way, and has allowed 43 receptions. He has a PFF grade of 48.5, which is definitely not very good. But I do think this was the right pick for the New York Giants to take. Ultimately, they have to develop him and have to make him a better player. This is a Giant secondary that honestly needs some talent, so I do think Deonte Banks, like I said, was the right pick. And while he hasn't blossomed into a star, I do think as of late he's gotten better and better. I just think it's going to take a little bit of time before we start mentioning his names up there in the top 15 range. While I do think that this player has a lot of room to grow, I'm not going to give it a super high grade. I'm going to give him a B. Next up with the 23rd overall pick, the Minnesota Vikings took Jordan Addison, the receiver out of USC. Now me personally, I did not really like this pick for the Minnesota Vikings because I felt they had a lot of other issues to address. I felt like receiving wise, they already had some really good players like Justin Jefferson, TJ Hawkinson, KJ Osborne, but I do think the way the draft fell for them, I can understand why they took this pick. And truth be told, it has worked out big time for the Minnesota Vikings. On the year, he has 54 receptions for 685 yards and 7 receiving touchdowns and has a PFF grade of 69.5. And of course, with the injury of Justin Jefferson, his role has amped up big time. And while at times he's been a little bit inconsistent, he's been one of the better receivers out of this rookie class. Hell, I'd even argue he's been the best receiver of this rookie class. I think if another player may have potentially fallen in this draft, I do think they would have taken him over Jordan Addison because this is a Minnesota Vikings team that does need a lot of talent, especially along the defensive line. But for now, given the context of the situation, he's going to be a very special receiver for many, many years. And the combination of Justin Jefferson, KJ Osborne, TJ Hawkinson, and Jordan Addison is going to be deadly for many years. So with that being said, I'm going to give this pick a solid A. Next up with the 22nd overall pick, the Baltimore Ravens selected Zay Flowers, the receiver out of Boston College. And me personally, I thought this was an incredible pick for the Baltimore Ravens. They needed somebody with speed, and that is exactly what Zay Flowers is. On the year, Zay Flowers has 58 receptions for 613 yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He also has a PFF grade of 74.9 and has been one of their better receivers this year. I am awfully extremely high for some reason on Zay Flowers. I think he has talent to be a very, very good receiver for many years. Would I say he's been better than Jordan Addison this year? I don't think I'd go that far. I think it's been a little bit more inconsistent from Zay Flowers, especially statistically wise. I love Zay Flowers out of college. I think his potential is through the roof, and I'd even argue that he might have more potential and talent than a guy like Jordan Addison. But for this grade, I want to remain unbiased, so I'm going to give this pick a solid B+. Next up with the 21st overall pick, the Los Angeles Chargers selected Quentin Johnston, the receiver out of TCU. Now in this draft, he was the second highest drafted receiver. So with that added context, has he been better than Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison? No. On the year, he has 21 receptions for 190 yards and 1 receiving touchdowns. He also has a PFF grade of 57.2. And with the injuries to Mike Williams, it was the expectation that he would come in and fill that spot. And ultimately, that has not been the case. He has been honestly really bad this year. Now, he was drafted as sort of a developmental guy who had a ton of talent, and while I still think he has the talent to become a very good receiver, I do still have my concerns for him. Because at this point in his season, he's been very unproductive, and I have to imagine his confidence is a little bit low right now. That being said, he has a quarterback in Justin Herbert who is going to make make anything work, so I do think this pick will eventually be better. But I think given the fact that a guy in Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison were already available, I don't think this pick made much sense. This was a Los Angeles Chargers team that already had some size and length in Keenan Allen and Mike Williams. They really needed a speed guy like Zay Flowers. So for that context added, I have to give this pick a relatively low grade, and that sucks because I actually really like Quentin Johnston. But I'm going to give this pick a D+. Next up with the 20th overall pick, the Seattle Seahawks took Jaxon Smith-Njigba, the receiver out of Ohio State. Now early into his season, he wasn't really receiving a whole lot of yards or targets, but as the season has gone on, he's been getting more and more production. And I do think this is a guy who was kind of put into a weird situation. He was going to be in a receiving room that already had 2 certified guys in DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. And given the context that he was the first overall receiver in this year's draft that was taken, I do think he's been maybe the 3rd or 2nd best one. Thus far this year, he has 38 receptions for 406 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a PFF grade of 62.7. And again, as time has gone on, this pick has gotten better and better. But despite the fact the Seattle Seahawks offense has been really bad this year, I do think that this pick is a little bit lower than a guy like Zay Flowers or Jordan Addison. That being said, I do really like his talent, especially in that Seattle Seahawks offense at that slot position, so I'm going to give this pick a B-. With the 19th overall pick, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers selected a defensive tackle out of Pittsburgh, Calijah Kancey. Now I'm going to be 100% transparent on this pick. I did not like this pick at all for Tampa Bay coming out of this year's draft. I understood that they wanted to add an explosive defensive tackle to add alongside a guy like Vita Vea, but I really wanted to see them go out there and take a guy like a Deonte Banks to add a little bit of youth to that secondary. But I'll eat my own words on this one. I think he's been relatively good for this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense. On the year, he has 9 solo tackles, 3 assisted tackles, and 3 sacks with a PFF grade of 54.2. And I think if you understand what he's good at and what he's not good at, I think this pick is going to age relatively decent. My one concern for Kancey is I wonder if he's ever really going to be able to stuff the run like a guy like a Vita Vea could. I think a good comparison for Calijah Kancey and where he could potentially go is a guy like Osa Odigizua, the defensive lineman for the Dallas Cowboys. Somebody who's a little bit undersized but is super explosive and can use his hands extremely effectively. I'm going to eat my own words on this one because coming out of the draft, I think I gave it like a D- draft pick. But I'll eat my own words because I think he's been put into a very nice situation down there in Tampa Bay. So I'm going to give this pick a nice and solid B. With the 19th overall pick, the Detroit Lions shocked everyone by taking the linebacker out of Iowa, Jack Campbell. The reason why I say shocked is because I don't think anyone thought he had a first-round talent, especially that high overall. But I think thus far this year, he's actually had a relatively good season. On the year, he has 32 solo tackles, 17 assisted tackles, and a bizarrely low PFF grade of 48.6. But I do think his PFF grade is not really indicative of how good he's been this year. It's been a little bit spotty for him, and at times he can be a little bit unproductive and can kind of get out of his own gaps. But I think when you add the context of what he's supposed to be for this team, I do think that he is a nice fit, especially alongside a guy like Alex Anzalone. And so while this pick may not be super high right now, I do think this pick has the potential to become a very, very, very good pick in a couple years. But for Jack Campbell, I'm not going to base this pick off of what he's going to be in a couple years because he was kind of drafted to be a very important player for this defense. So for now, I'm going to give Jack Campbell a B-. Next up with the 17th overall pick, the New England Patriots selected the cornerback out of Oregon, Christian Gonzalez. I have zero clue why this guy fell so far in this year's draft. I had him as a locked top 10 pick, but he fell ultimately to the 17th overall pick. And I'm sure the New England Patriots are extremely glad he did because on the season before his injury, he was having a spectacular year. Before the injury, he had 15 solo tackles, 1 interception, and he had 16 receptions allowed. He also had a PFF grade of 80.8, which thus far in this video is the highest grade. And I think moving forward, Christian Gonzalez is going to be a very talented and a really good player for many years to come. I do really hope and pray that this injury that he is going through is nothing permanent and can be something that can get fixed and worked through because I'm extremely high on Christian Gonzalez and I think he has top 10 cornerback potential. So for this pick, I'm going to give it an A+. And then lastly, with the 16th overall pick, the Washington Commanders took the cornerback out of Mississippi State, Emmanuel Forbes. Now, I just did a full-fledged video already on the Washington Commanders, so if you want to check that out, I have that pinned at the very end of this video. But in that video, I do discuss Emmanuel Forbes in a little bit more detail. On the year, he has 26 solo tackles, 1 interception, he's allowed 27 receptions, and has a PFF grade of 52.9. That being said, he is not currently a starter on this team. Granted, if they do have some injuries, I'm sure that he would be the starter. And at times, he has been exposed by some really big receivers like A.J. Brown or C.D. Lamb or so on and so forth. I personally had a 3rd-round grade on Emmanuel Forbes because I viewed him as a very talented player, but ultimately was going to have to be developed into that talent. I think his upside is a guy like Trevon Diggs, but I think ultimately his downside is really bad. And thus far this year, it has not been pretty at all. He has potential, and I'm not willing to count him out just yet, but I think ultimately this grade is going to be relatively low, especially in comparison to Christian Gonzalez, which honestly makes the pick even worse because the next cornerback taken after him is going to be a top 10 corner for many years to come. But I'm sorry, Washington Commanders fans, I have to give this pick a D-. But that will go ahead and conclude part 1 of grading the NFL rookies. Again, to reiterate, in a couple of days I'm going to be dropping part 2, which will be covering the top 15 picks. So if you do enjoy NFL content, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it helps me out a ton, as well as share this video to all your friends and family who may also enjoy NFL content. But I love you guys. Peace.